morning, everyone. Thanks for joining on time. So we can see that there are some participants are still trying to join the webinar. Let's give them another few minutes, and I'll be back soon. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for waiting just now, and let's get started. A very good morning to everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar with the title of Managing Sustainability Program. Let's start with data. I'm your host today. I'm Macy. Hope you will be enjoying this session today. In today's world, the importance of sustainability cannot be overstated. Organizations across industries are realizing that sustainability is not just a choice, but a responsibility we all share. Today, we are here to explore how can we manage sustainability by getting started with data to drive positive change and create a long-term value. Throughout this webinar, we will navigate the complex landscape of sustainability and data, addressing key questions and providing actionable insights. We will explore the importance of differentiating sustainability from ESG, identify the essential data elements for comprehensive sustainability management, and learn best practices for collecting, managing, processing, and reporting sustainability data. So let me introduce our main speaker for today. Mr. Kyu Ling, our Executive Director from KewMann's. He has more than 20 years experience working with the large organizations such as the financial institutions, the governments, and more to provide them with innovative solutions. And he has also assisted a lot of customers with transformation needs from big data analytics to AI and behavioral science. So some of the big customers that he has worked with is MasterCard, NTUC Income, and more. So without further ado, let's pass the floor to Ling. Over to you, Ling.
Thank you very much, Missy. I believe every one of you can see the screen. Welcome to this event and thank you very much for your time. And for today, I would like to share a little bit more about sustainability, the hottest topic in town. And I believe this topic is actually appear in the newspaper and magazines every day, right? But let me first define what's the needs about sustainability and how it is linked to E, S, and G, right? I believe everyone that actually come into this particular event or webinar would know either sustainability and or ESG, right? ESG basically is defined as environmental, social, and governance. And typically, when everyone's heard of the word of sustainability, inevitably, their minds would be thinking about just the E part, the environmental part, which is actually not wrong, right? Because the the associability about these two words are very very strong. And from the E perspective, environmental perspective, everyone is thinking about GHG emission, which is basically carbon emission, right? And thinking about renewable energy, about climate change, about flood, about extreme weathers, about water stress, and so forth. However, sustainability has much more than this. It's also covered from the S perspective, which is social, right? How the organizations and observe that I use the word organizations rather than companies, which I'll come to that in my next slides, right? On the works that they have been doing for community engagement. For example, is there any events that they've been hosting for cleaning up the beaches, to visit the also homes, to organize donation for floods happens elsewhere. How about the contribution to human rights or observe human rights? Do they have any forced labor or modern slavery that happens inside the organizations or in the supply chain? Right. Next up is of course how they treat their own people, the human capital aspect. Are they involving a lot of female and male or gender non-biases, right? And of course how they treat labors in general. So that's social. And of course, we for the S and the G, the challenge would be what is acceptable for that particular societies and countries in particular, because what's acceptable in the S and the G is not able to define in a cohesive manner for the whole world. For example, what's acceptable for the Western world may not be acceptable for Saudi Arabia or culturally Japan, right? Because every single country's races and also communities are different from defining the S and the G. And how we define S and the G is by generally acceptance principles, right? And now let me define the G that being generally acceptable. That's from, for example, reducing the corruptions and bribery. We have to observe that, right? And we have to conduct business in an ethical manner. How do we define the ownership that's proper? And also try to protect the data privacy for our staff, for our customers and suppliers, and also how do we govern cybersecurity aspect around it. So that's generally acceptable governance principle across the world, right? So let's define the E, the S, and the G. Now the next topics that I would like to talk about is that is this too similar? And sustainability and ESG, while conceptually they are similar, but they are not 100% similar, right? If you look at strictly from a definition standpoint, sustainability is actually more towards the ESG. So what's the first E? The first E is actually economic. Economic basically is balancing the short term and the long term, right? Economy, even though you are government agencies or you are non-NGO, right, non-governmental organizations, you have your economic functions. You are there to serve the citizens. You are there to serve a particular purposes. So that's what is defined as economic. And of course, from company perspective, it is about for profit, right? How do you run organizations to sustain profitability and long-term survival, right? So that's sustainability differences versus ESG. And sustainability is covering everyone. That includes, of course, companies, large and small, the government agencies, the NGOs, and down to us as individuals, right? And it's all about, like I mentioned, I think when we first look at the word ESG, sustainability, it's always about first started with, okay, that's about the second E, which is the environmental, right? The climate change, the weather conditions, the water stress. And the word ESG is mostly evolved in the investment and companies arena, right? That's because they are really focusing on the companies that, if, for example, if you are an investor, you invested in, they're having uh, focus and plans into a longer term aspect. For example, how are they going to contribute to environmental? And are they practicing good practices to sustain uh, environmental aspect, the social aspect, as well as governance aspect? And the belief is that if the organizations that you are invested in or you have vested interest is focusing on the E, the S, and the G combined, they will be able to, is pretty much investable, right? And therefore, the scores of ESG, the ratings are very important when we talk about ESG versus sustainability, right? Now, after we define sustainability and ESG, the next thing that we'd like to ask ourselves is, okay, so what? What's in it for me, right? If you are government agencies across the region or you are NGO, you need to lead by examples, right? Everyone has committed to Paris Agreement, which, of course, not everyone, but I think the majority of the whole world is has been signing off on that. Now, as a government agencies or NGOs, you need to lead from the front to understand where you stand, right? You need to report where you are as of this point. I know that some government agencies or some government in certain countries are actually reporting it. However, it's actually the numbers from a few years back. So you need to find ways to capture and report the data in a more recent manner. And after you know where you stand, you need to actually provide everyone, right, including your people in your country and of course the whole world, of your strategy on how do you get better in terms of sustainability. Define your strategy upfront, right, and of course execute that. So that's actually what the governments and NGO needs about knowing sustainability, because it's your vested interest. You have actually committed to that, right? The next is if you are companies, right? If you are companies for public listed companies in the region, then the first word that you come into your mind is FINE, fine, right? So most of the exchange in this region has a mandatory quantitative measurements starting from this year, right? If not next year. And rather than a few years back where you can randomly pick some high level statements, qualitative statements in your sustainability reports, right now is no longer okay, right? You need to report a prescribed way of quantitative measurements so that your exchanges will be able to look at the numbers and evaluate them all together, right? So that's actually something that mandated across the region, that what we have observed. And that's actually allowing you in exam halls, for example, settings, on submitting your exam papers. Your exam papers potentially may not score good grades because that's where you are. In the exams, we are talking about knowledge that you have put in, the studies that you have put in. So the score may not be good, and it may be okay, it may not be okay, right? So that's where you are. Now, the next questions, if you are public listed companies or PLCs, is people will look at whether you are investment grade, right? Investment grade, there's a number of things that are being defined. In countries, when you are submitting your sustainability reports in a quantitative manner, everyone can look at it and can start providing score. Of course, that's individuals, organizations, or investors, right? That they have their own methods on defining that. However, when you look at a global context, a worldwide context, they are ESG raters that everyone comes to, in a way, fear, right? The likes of FTSE for Good, the likes of MSCI, the likes of S&P, the likes of Dow Jones, the likes of Moody's. and the list can go on, right? And it's not a surprise that, for example, in about a few months ago, Tencent, a large China tech giant, has been downgraded from a sustainability standpoint by MSCI, and immediately the stocks drop because it is not so much on the rating on ESG from the perspective of MSCI has been dropped, right? So that's the problems that I think the public listed companies will need to take care of, right? Submitting it in a quantitative manner is that once, but how good are you? And you need to measure it up. And of course, from a regional stock exchange perspective, a lot of them has been defined that they need to adhere to TCFD, which is a standard in for Task Force for Climate Financial Related Disclosure, right? So that's TCFD standards. You need to comply to if you are a listed company. So those are where the kind of headaches that when we talk to the public listed companies, they are very, very aware, right? Next off is actually for the all other companies, right? So all other companies that would be defined as, for example, any trading company, any manufacturing companies, and if you are plantation companies, you are construction company, and so on and so forth, right? If you are going to trade with or supply to Western companies, that is when you need to take extra notice, right? Number one is that to become their vendor in an ongoing basis, you need to comply to their needs to submit in a sustainability report or ESG reports, right? How can you get it done? So that's actually one way that you need to think of. And if you are doing that, likelihood you have a preferential status with that, right? Preferential status simply means that, okay, there's a list that they will be able to trade. Ultimately, this Western company, if they are big enough, right, in the Western world, they are likely to be subject to their own sustainability reporting. One aspect of sustainability reporting is supply. Their supplier, which is you, right? In this case, if your scores is good, which implies that their score is good, and therefore they will be able to give you a preferential rate to trade with them and to supply goods and services to them, right? The next off is carbon tax, right? Carbon tax is actually starting to get enforced across the whole world, right? I think in this part of the world, we have seen that certain buckets of carbon marketplaces, carbon markets has been actually evolving, right? And in the Western world, carbon tax has been will be able to kickstart in a very near future. And in this case, if you are not performing well in your ESG, especially the E perspective, right, you need to pay a carbon tax, and that will increase your cost in trading with the Western world, right? You will actually have a bigger impacts to you. Now, next is everyone will require financing to work, right? Most of us as companies, right? And if you require financing with the banks or other financial institutions, upcoming in 2024, a number of countries in this part of the world, for example, Malaysia, Singapore, and the rest, would actually mandate that all banks will need to look at the aspect of ESG of the borrowers to determine whether you have a preferential rate with them. So ultimately, what this means is that if you are borrowing money as an organization or as a company, from next year onwards, the banks will ask for a sustainability report from you or ESG reports from you. If you have one, provide that, and if the score is good, you get a better rate than the rest, right? If you don't have it, I think the banks will still give you, assuming that your financial standing is good. However, you don't enjoy the preferential rates that will be given from those that are practicing ESG in a very defined manner. And next off is that if you are a startup or you are a scale up, you want to raise fund for VCs, other investor, angels, private equities, and so forth, this is actually for you as well, right? Because fundraising for them, for the investors, will also need to look at your ESG standing so that they won't also be scrutinized by their own partners or the ones that chip in funds to fund them, right? So the LPs and so forth. So that's where, if you are companies, you have vested interest to look at where are you standing and how do you improve from a sustainability standpoint. Next off, is if you are individuals like you and me, right? What's in it for you? Obviously, for us, we want to live in a healthier and greener world, right? So that our siblings, our children will be able to grow happily ever after. So that's what we want to do to ensure that we are all contributing to sustainability. Now, this is actually something that somehow no one tried to link, and I believe I'm the one of the earlier person, if not the only person, that actually defined this. Right. Um, Recently, I read a book called the Firm, which talk about um, McKinsey, right? The renowned consulting companies, and they trace the road back to early 1920s, right? So they talk about the founders who look at accounting, and at that point in time, accounting is just get started. And it struck me that accounting and finance and sustainability, you can link it together. But that's about a decades, sorry, not decades, a century difference, right? So let's look at it from accounting perspective in the early 90s, right? Early 90s, we are talking about, for them, learn how to get started from looking at accounting. How do they collect the data from accounting purposes, and so forth. And now sustainability, we are the same. We are looking at, okay, there are different indicators as defined as the needs by the stock exchange or by the different sustainability standards. And you need to learn how to get started. You need to start learning how to collect all this data required to do reporting, right? To establish the baseline. Next off is that accounting, you need to define your standards. You need different departments in your organizations to collect all this data. Okay, this is manufacturing data, this is the supply chain data, and this is the human resource data, and so forth. You need to define the process of getting all this data, right? Similarly for sustainability, right? This particular indicators is actually from a talent management perspective. This is from managing suppliers perspective. This is from your carbon emission perspective. How do you establish a process to collect all this data, right? And the other comparison is that now you have all this data. How do you use it for management actions? You want to use this to improve, right, your organization standings from accounting and finance standpoint, right? So that's evolved to become management accounting. Similarly, from sustainability standpoint, you need to look at where you are from your carbon emission, from your trainings to provide to the anti money laundering courses and so forth. And how do you want to get improvement of it? Not right now, you have 75%, for example, of your staff to stand to the training for anti-corruption courses, and you want to increase that to 90, you want to increase that to 100, for example, right? The metrics for accountings at that point in time, and of course currently as well, is the cost, the revenue, the profits, and of course how do we define that? This pretty much depending on your industry. A manufacturing industry is different from trading. A trading is different from a banks. Similarly, from a sustainability standpoint, we are actually measuring the indicators from carbon emission, waste, supply compliance, and so forth. And of course, every single industries are different, right? If you are a banks, that's different from how do you measure sustainability from a manufacturing versus a trading and so forth, right? And back then, in 1 century ago, right? Auditing has not get started from accounting standpoint. They are just merely reporting it. At that point in time, the auditing is only going to subject to auditing very soon, and that's similar to sustainability. Right now, everyone, including the government agencies that want to enforce this, including the stock exchanges, and that may include large organizations that want their suppliers to submit their sustainability reports, right? Right now, it doesn't require audit per se, right? But sooner or later, trust me, I think it will actually get to auditing very soon, right? So that's actually something that it is as important as accounting in about a century ago, from a sustainability standpoint. where we have engaged with all the organizations, be it the government agencies in various countries in this part of the world, as well as mostly the larger organizations, the listed organizations. These are what some of the organizations are doing, right? They are engaging consultants to embark on where we are, how can we get started, how do we meet the sustainability goals, right? So that's actually the first step that typically they are going to do, or they will be hiring experienced chief sustainability officer or head of sustainability so that they can get started. The next is they are trying to understand the different indicators, the matrices and the standards, and where they are standing and how are they going to improve on. So they want to receive some recommendations for improvement, for example. And they also start to look at what are the additional gaps. For example, right now, they don't keep track of the data, right? Or the data is merely manual. And how can they be filled? Or all these gaps, how are they going to be filled? Finding the right data and so forth. And that's the aspect that they want to monitor as well as tracking, right? The next item would be now I have this being defined. Anywhere that I can optimize that. So because ultimately in the next upcoming slides, I have one slide to talk about a real case study of uh, a medium to large organizations that actually spend huge amount of human capital and to actually compile basically just where we are, right? The sustainability reports. And that particular process is very labor intensive and time consuming process. And then that's just to meet the reporting and regulatory requirements. And now this is not even talking about how do we improve, right? So just merely tracking perspective. The organizations would need to find a way to automate that and move up to the value chain to look at what are the other ways to improve. That's actually more values to be driven. And that's also something that I have been come across quite often, right? Especially the smaller organizations or the ones that even if they are listed, they want to try to take some risks, right, for lack of better word. So the statement is that what if I simply report, which means that, okay, I don't have a lot of data, and I don't think they are going to do anything with me. I either not report or I just simply report. I just put in a set random numbers and I submit up. What will happen, right? So this is what will happen. Number one is at your own risk, of course, because it's a number that you are going to report, right? Number two is that, as I mentioned, right now, yes, I think everyone encouraged you to submit, knowing where you are, right? And sooner or later, this data is going to be audited, right? Can you withstand the audit? And if you fail the audit, and especially there's no basis on the data, even if you are doing a guesstimates, if you are doing a calculated estimates, I think that's still fine. You need to justify, right? If you are not even doing that, if you don't have the data, right, then again you may have subject to fine. You may lose the investor confidence. You may lose your reputation and trust that you have been building up for years. That's the problem of simply report. Going back to a century ago, if someone simply report accounts, right, and finance, obviously it's the same thing that is going to happen now. You can't simply report your sustainability reports, right? Next is why data and reporting are very important, right? Obviously, you need the data and reports to know where you are from a sustainability standpoint, and you need to identify the gaps on all your current actions, right? And with the gaps, you know how to use set the targets, right? I go back to the examples. Let's use the human capital as an example, right? Assuming that your score from a gentle biases perspective, you have uneven, right, of male and female in your directorship or your workforce, then you can actually set the targets, set the timeline, and prioritize that. And of course, then you'll be able to focus. You may not need to plug the gaps immediately, but you need to provide the whole world, targets that you set, and also timeline that you want to achieve. Now that's actually you can formulate a sustainability strategy, right? Um, E, S, and G. You can't lack off. You can't actually forego any of this. You need to have a strategy to look at where are the bigger gaps, where are the low hanging fruit that you can get done very easily to move up to your standings, and also you'll be able to now then able to look at what are the correct action, but you need a bigger investments to get done. So you need a particular timeline, the low hanging fruit, the impacts of your actions, and so forth. Right. Moving on is the baseline for your executions, and also the tracking and monitoring aspect of it. So that's when data and reporting provide you and the markets and others stakeholders, right, a view of where you are, and also what are the actions that you plan to take, and whether you are adhere to that particular plan, right? And taking a step back though, during the engagement with everyone, right, we actually heard of many challenges. That includes the understanding of the sustainability standards and frameworks, right? There are too many of it, honestly, right? So just now I used the term TCFD, and for the government agencies, typically they are looking at GRI, and ISSB is going to come in force very, very soon. And I think some different companies, for example, Singapore government will want to have to adopt some versions of ISSB, and also to modify it so that they can actually have their own version of sustainability reporting from the government standpoint, right? So the standards are evolving, the framework are evolving, and how do you make sure you know all of it, right? The other challenges that I learned with my team is to to get down to work, you need to involve many stakeholders, and you need to involve many departments, which we'll come to that in the next coming slides, right? And you need to understand where are the source data, who keep track of that, and understand the calculations and data processing for different indicators. For the stock exchange perspective, the public companies may subject to up to tens. Some are 20, some are 30, some are 40s, right? Depending on the industry that you are actually living in. And if you also want to look at the bigger scheme of things like FTSE for Good, S&P, and so forth, uh, quite a number of them are subject to more than hundreds indicators, right? So that's the headaches that the head of sustainability would need to look at, right? The next obvious that you have different versions of the data, right? HR will send you something today, and supply chain management will send you something tomorrow, and so forth. So how can you keep track of different versions of data? Which one is new, right? Accountability, who sent you or which system sent you something at what time, and so that's something that you need to track, which is again a particular headache. And you need to look at the reports and tracking of the results for submission. Because very importantly is that now this is all about current. This is what we have as an organization. How can I get to improve it? So that's the next questions that you will be being asked as a chief sustainability officer. So this is the magnitude of the challenges, right? So every single E, S, and G, who are responsible for the different sections? When we talk about the E, the carbon emission, the water, the waste, and so forth, that belongs to facility or building management? They belongs to the manufacturing? They belongs to the HR? Who owns the data, or who owns the process? Every single organization is going to have different people to own that, and you need to map that out, right? Similarly, that happens to social, right? Is that the HR own this? Do you have a corporate office? Do you have a board to manage that, or is your supply chain person in charge, right? From a G perspective, is that your board? Is that your corporate office? And because that involves data privacy and security, is that your IT? Do you have an IT information security chief to actually look at this? So those are where you need to map out all this, who is responsible for what, and so that then you can get down to business, right? So I have been talking about this before, right? This is actually just from a tracking perspective. Let's not talk about improvement, right? From a tracking perspective, on an average basis, the number is pretty similar from Singapore and Malaysia purposes, and we take an average, right? From the organizations that we are working with, this is the numbers that generally applies, right? So typically they have like two full-time employees, the head of sustainability or someone responsible for that, and there are a lot of part-time employees. The part-time employees are the ones that I call the human collaborator, or the IT folks, or someone that really helping to supply the data, no matter they extract from the system, they work with you to provide some estimates and so forth. So that's part-time employees per se, right? But they are doing other works as well. So you have your money spending and yearly spending, and look at the numbers. You need to spend about 400,000, no matter it's ringgit Malaysia or Sing dollar, just for the purpose on tracking where you are, right? And look at the number of hours that they have to spend, right? So that's the kind of spendings that they will cost you, right? And this is not talking about you have the numbers right now and how do you improve, right? So that's a different aspect. You may have to get a consultants, you may get your sustainability officer to actually review and actually take actions on it. But what if just from a data collection standpoint, you'll be able to reduce the cost by more than 50%, right? So that's something that we as organizations, we try to help other organizations to embark on. So very quickly, that will includes where to get the data, right? Where to get the data is important because depending on what kind of organizations you are in, if you are public companies, you may have to adhere to the individual stock exchange, right? Now, if you have the indicators, and both Bursa Malaysia and SGX have released their own indicators and how they want it to be reported, and you need to look at where are the potential data sources and the potential data structures from your systems, or how do you track it. And you may sometimes find that does it even be tracked, and if not, you need to assign somebody to start tracking, if not estimating it, right? So that's the baseline. Again, go back to accounting a century ago. If someone is not tracking that and is required to become a cost or to become a revenue, we need to start looking at ways to track that. Now, from a data point gathering and discovery standpoint, that will also includes, for example, a number of ways, right? You need to start talking about connecting to system. That's your ERP, your supply chain management, your HR systems. But as per our engagement with most of the organizations, they would like to use Excel, and most of the data are currently tracking manually using a human collaborator, as I call it. And so therefore, Excel upload is one key function that's expected. The next off is that if you are pretty advanced, you have sensors to track certain waste, certain water, and even carbon emission for certain factory consumptions, then that's a very accurate representation. So you may need to connect to your sensors to get real-time setting, right? So that's how data to be collected. And moving on is that how do you apply to, from a data analysis standpoint, guided formulas and calculations, right? So that's also a headache that you need to look at. But if you have a system, you'll be able to let go all these headaches to a system, and that would automatically churn out a recognizable sustainable reports, right? That you can do as frequent as you need, especially if let's say you are listed companies and you want to apply loans, you can actually provide the up-to-date version of your sustainable reports, right? Now with the baseline, you can now set your goals, you can now monitor, you can now track, and you can also receive recommendations on the analysis given, and also on the risk and opportunity. So that will include supplier recommendations, for example. That will include you may be wanting to do simulations and analysis, and that will include analysis of potentially your peers, right? And you can look at the different scenarios and how the risk towards your policies and legal, your technologies, your markets, And also, you can also look at the other side of the coins from this perspective. That's the opportunity. You may want to look at your resource efficiency, right? And how do you use your energy sources, right? And whether there's recommendation on renewable energies and so forth. So that's an important aspect, that not just about tracking and reporting. You are now able to execute uh, the strategy and the plans, right, that you have to mitigate the risk and take advantage of the opportunity that has been recommended by a solution. So when I step to all these capabilities, that will include, for example, capabilities to collect data through, as I mentioned, a human collaborator. We know that not every single indicators that you need to define for ESG, you will be able to have a system, and therefore you are able to work with, for example, in this case, a facility manager in your organizations to let her providing you this data through a collaborative workflow, right? And you can also look at getting it from a system. For example, in this case, if waste are being tracked in your SAP, you can actually get the SAP dumped into a public folder, and the system will be able to pick up and also map to a required data fields. And that will allow the automatic data update from your system, for example, from a daily or weekly standpoint. And from an automatic data update perspective, you can also do it from a sensors. That's the best way, right? A more accurate way to so that there's no ambiguity about the data, and it's all about connecting your sensors, your IoT devices data directly to the system. Now, I talked about audit earlier. So it's all about trusted data, right? So whether the data that you have been collected from human collaborator, from system, from the sensor standpoint, are they trusted, right? So we have been working with a regional premier um, blockchain provider called Ditoco, right? So they have a trust platform, and ultimately the data that we store towards KewSustain, our sustainability platform, is actually being able to tamper proof, right, by a Ditoco trust platform, so that in a way Ditoco guarantees that the data stored within the platform, within the timeline, has not been tampered, because a hash would be generated for the data that store within the store within the KewSustain data hub. Now, beyond the data itself, is all about the calculation. So we have the formulas, we have the standards of the calculations for different matrices and indicators to ensure that the calculations are trusted and following individual standards that you need to adhere to, and allows you to have a few clicks to generate the sustainable reporting that you want to do it as frequent as possible, and also subject to a approval flow to the chain of, for example, a C levels or even board of directors approval. And for every single organizations that we work with, the C levels, especially the CEO, always ask for real-time dashboard, and that has been provided. However, I need to actually pour some cold water into it. Right now, a lot of the data points that we collect or we manage to collect are actually collected to human collaborator, which means subject to the availability of data. And that typically is periodic, right? Every day, every week, every month, or every quarter, that this human collaborator will update new data. So even if you have a real-time dashboard, it may not reflect the current situations. But when more and more data points are being fed in a system and also sensor manner, then real-time dashboard will have this view to reflect to the sea levels, so that they can make sustainable reporting in a more timely fashion. And you can also use it to simulate the goal that you have, right? And then you can also use it to compare, and this is the results of the simulation analysis, right? And that you can actually take actions upon. From a peer analysis standpoint, you can actually compare your organizations with other organizations from an aspect of the E, the S, and the G, right? And then you can actually look at where you are. And last but not least, you can also look at the risk and the opportunity standpoint from different matrices in risk, different matrices in opportunity. Now, beyond just about getting the data ready, having it being tracked, having some recommendations, that's solve the short term and the medium term aspect, right? So you are improving from your scores, but you have not improved the mind of your stakeholders. So in your organizations, there are a lot of stakeholders. Let's start from employee. And of course, it can be your customers, it can be your suppliers, right? So in the upcoming release, we actually release a app-based tools so that you digitally nudge, recommend, and reward your stakeholders. That will include, for example, the employees on practicing the right sustainability culture, right? That they have to start from all these employees that you have, all these customers that you have, and all the suppliers that you have, so that everyone will contribute to the same goal of sustainability for the whole world. So the next things that you need to look at is, especially if you are listed companies, now you have the baseline, you have the recommendations. Next is how about going international, right? When you go internationals, you're subject to all these international ratings agencies, right? The FTSE4Good, the Dow Jones, the MSCI, and also the S&P global ratings. So the system will be able to now track, for example, if you are good, if your indicative score is good for FTSE4Good, but now if you try to convert it to MSCI, there's still certain parts that you need to improve, and we tell you where are there, and so that you can actually plug the hole, so that MSCI would also look at you as the score will be much improved from a MSCI perspective. In summary, right? So we are going to leverage on a trusted and auditable way to collect the data from various sources that you are. That will include human collaborators, system, and also sensors. And you have a headache-free way on calculations and compliance reporting. That will include the goal setting, monitoring and tracking, recommendation on the analysis, the risk, and also the opportunity. That will help you to meet your demand and also to improve basing upon a common global standards that will help you to save costs, to improve and ensure compliance, and ready in the age for the age of sustainability. That's the end of my sharing, and I'll pass the floor back to Macy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine, for your insightful presentation. I think your sharing would be definitely very valuable for all of us and could help us to better understand on how to enhance sustainability performance with all these practical knowledges. So now let's move on to our panel session for today. So we will have Ling with us again to share more insights and address questions that we have collected offline from some of the participants and customers. And if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions on the chat beside the presentation screen. And then we will try to address all the questions that we have collected offline first before taking more questions from the floor. And if we do have enough time. So let's get started, Yoling. So the first question we have here is that there are too many sustainability standards and frameworks out there. Which one should we follow?
A very good question, and this is a pretty common question that I receive from government agencies or public listed companies per se, right? My quick answers to that is that let's follow what you need to follow first, right? As the bare minimum. If you are PLCs, then inherently you need to follow your own stock exchanges sustainability guidelines. So Pusa, Malaysia, we have one. Obviously, SGX also have one. And if you are from Hong Kong, you are from Thailand, you are from China, you are from Australia, every one of these exchanges will have one, right? So follow that closely for the sustainability guidelines on what is the indicators that's needed, what are the data that need to be collected. Follow closely on this line of thoughts. The next thing is the needs on individual exchanges. For example, Singapore and Malaysia exchanges would also need to mandate the adoptions of TCFD in the near future, like 2024. So you also need to go towards that, right? So that's a minimum for the PLCs. Now for the public listed companies, for the government agencies, most of the government agencies right now are adopting GRI, right, Global Reporting Initiatives. However, I think for those who follow closely on the trend, you know that regardless of you are public sector companies or you are a government agencies, uh, a new emerging standards are going to be released and has been adopted pretty closely by all the advanced countries like the G7. So that's called ISSB. You'll be having the final version of it very soon in the near future. And assume that GRI will be slowly replaced by these ISSB standards since it's accounting standards recognized worldwide. So that's my answer to the questions. Of course, there are all other standards out there. Do take a look, and I think there are merits to actually taking a look and compare and contrast. But you need to look at the minimum that you need to go comply first.
Okay, thanks, Yoling. So I think it will be very helpful for everyone, especially for the PLC. Yep. So there's another question, which is one of the participants. He actually shared his current situation. So they haven't compared the required data source for the sustainability indicators truly, but they suspect that they don't have everything tracked and may not have data for all the required indicators. So what is your suggestion to them?
Right. Good questions. And this is not a new questions to me as well because no matter you are large and small organizations, even though you are large and you think that you have a lot of data available, however, I think from the first showing of the indicators and the requirements data for sustainability guidelines, for example, for the PLCs, a lot of them knows that they do not keep all this data or they don't have a way to keep this data or track this data at the current in the current processes, right? So in this case, don't worry. Just like going back to my thoughts about accounting in the 19 in about a century ago, similar situations. Don't worry, but I think you need to start having a way to track this data. It could be manual first, then you can also implement systems or sensors to track that. But start looking at where are the gaps and start looking at ways to track, and you have a roadmap on tracking that and also improving that. And if you and that's actually when you know all these indicators and the data needs, right? So therefore, the first step is really looking at comparing all the indicators that your industry are needed and also the data needs before you can actually make any actions going forward.
Okay. Thanks, Yoling. So as opposed to the earlier questions, right? So there's another participant sharing that they are well prepared in knowing the standards and started the data collection process manually. So why should they choose you, and what are the advantages of using your solution?
Thank you very much for the questions. In fact, first I would like to congratulate these particular participants because not a lot would be prepared, right? There are some that we have spoken to, they have more prepared. They know where the data are and they are starting to collect the data manually. So the keyword is manually, right? And we know that that's the pain point out there. So going back to one of the slides that I have shared earlier on, when you collect manually, which means that a lot of your staff, even though they are part-time, spending time into helping these initiatives out, is their time, right? So easily, if you're cutting across all the matrices or indicators in the E, the S, and the G, that's more than 10 people, and we have already shared the potential cost that is going to be involved. So the first thing that as a value to so-called fully manual data collection, it is really about reducing their involvement and having a process in place through the software that we offer to collect the data automatically or in a structured manner and trackable manner so that that process are being streamlined and rather than being a bit more reactive, right? So that's the first outcome that I think you can envision when you use the solution. And I think over and above this on cost sharing or effort reductions is really about now you have a good night's sleep, right? The reason is that now you doesn't need to worry about auditing the all the data and who is doing what are the data that being uploaded by who, when is this going to happen or has happened, is all being tracked, right? So you are not going to fail your auditing because of this. That's the key that the good comfort that you can actually be living upon, right? And the last but not least, of course, it's not about submitting or having the data being tracked and reported. That's just like in an exam hall, right? You are going to hand in your exam papers. That's a good step. However, your exam papers may suggest that you are good in certain things, you are not good in certain things, and really the purpose for the exams and by extension for this particular exercise is now I know where I am. How can I better improve that, right? So that's actually the recommendation engine that we have inbuilt, as I shared previously, that able to help you to move towards to move your organizations towards a better sustainability future.
Okay, thanks, Ling. Hope this will be insightful for the participants. And these are the questions that we collected from offline. So I have saw another question that posted to me privately. So this participant actually shared that they have already engaged with an ESG consultant who is doing quite a good job from his point of view. So he's interested to know how could you add value to what they are doing now.
Yep. Thanks for the questions, and I think there are a number of organizations that we engage with have already engaged ESG consultant, and that's actually something that is good. Number one, we are not here to replace any ESG consultants. They are there to really doing a lot of bespoke contributions to your organizations, right? However, to facilitate their work, definitely they will need to ask data from you, right? Hey, this indicator require this particular piece of data, for example, anti-corruption training conducted by your team. How do you collect your data for all your buildings in terms of your electricity usage and so forth? So those are the data points that they still need to collect from you, right? So the data collection part and the readiness of the data, the authenticity of the data, the auditability of the data is all not covered by the ESG consultant. They need it from you, right? So once they have that, then I think their work would be more streamlined. That's the additional values that we can give. In essence, I think when the time they say I need this data to when you can provide this data, I think that time can be shortened. And of course, they will offer a lot more bespoke advice, for example, how to use sustainability, your current sustainability situations, as well as your business capabilities, to even improve revenue from tapping into the sustainability team. So those are the values that they can offer. But net, I think from a recommendation standpoint, I think for a machine like what we offer through the software, and human like your ESG consultant, we can work hand in hand to ensure that you are better covered from the compliance perspective as well as from sustainable future perspective.
Okay, I see. So once again, thank you, Yuli, for your time and all the valuable insights that you have shared with us. So unfortunately, we are running out of time now. So thanks for those who have posted questions to us privately as well. So we will try to address your questions through email after the webinar. So in case you have more questions, you can feel free to interact with us through email. So we appreciate your time in joining us today, and we hope you found this session informative and hope you have gained something, get useful insight from the session. So we are coming to the end of the session. So hope to see you again and have a nice day ahead. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.